You should never do something under the impulse of emotions, otherwise it can lead to very bad consequences. My wife saw no boundaries and thought she could do whatever she wanted, and I wouldn't do anything to her for it. She made a mistake and paid dearly for it. The hill wasn't high, but it was steep. The cart's wheels sank deep into the sand, jostling the sole passenger and threatening to throw her onto the road. She had nowhere to sit. Her hands were tied, and a large hemp noose hung from her neck. She wore only a simple deerskin dress and a shawl made of bird feathers and seashells. A young lieutenant rode behind the cart on a sway-backed horse, a shabby beast but the best he could afford. He wore a plain red wool uniform coat, with its only extravagance being 6 silver buttons. 2 laconic soldiers strolled behind as if out for a walk on a warm spring day. The sky was overcast and the Canarsie marshland was damp, promising an impending storm. A small crowd had gathered at the hilltop where a crude scaffold made of hewn timbers stood. The crowd awaited the spectacle of the witch's execution. She had been tried and convicted of cavorting with the devil and practicing black arts. Her name was Little Bird That Sits in the Tree, but the English called her Sparrow. She had healed the sick among the poor when the fever had spread across the eastern colony during the last outbreak. Clearly this, along with her worship of the native gods, was proof of her witchcraft. She was one of the last survivors of the Canarsie tribe, whose home this land was. Her native blood was the best evidence of her guilt. The lieutenant, a Scot by birth named James Wilson, observed that Sparrow was just a girl, barely more than a child. Though she was dressed and looked like an Indian, she was not of pure blood. Yet she stood out from the ragged group on the hill. These colonials were a fur bunch. The preacher who judged the witch and his family were only a half step above the crowd. The cart creaked to a halt below the makeshift scaffold. The executioner attached the noose to the rope. At this point, the preacher, a tall, pinched-faced man named Simon Pierce, stepped forward and asked the girl to repent for the sake of her immortal soul. The crowd murmured restlessly, but the girl didn't flinch. In clear, unaccented English, she spoke. "You have taken everything from us, our gods, our land, and now our lives. But all this will be reclaimed, for the sea will rise and take everything away. On that day, you will pay for our blood, for this is my cur." Whatever else she might have said was cut off as the cart jerked forward, whether by plan or accident, causing Sparrow to hang by the rope. She gurgled, and her face turned black. Her tongue protruded, and she would have suffered a slow death had the officer not leaped from his horse and grabbed her legs. With a sharp pull, he snapped her neck, mercifully ending the grisly scene. As the crowd dispersed, the ditch diggers stepped forward. One was an Irishman and the other was an African American, both of whom had arrived in this so-called New World as slaves. Though now technically free, they occupied the lowest tier of a subsistence society. Together with the officer and soldiers, they took down Sparrow's body. James Wilson carried her to the bottom of the hill, where a grave had been dug. The preacher had wanted the body burned and the ashes scattered, but the regimental colonel refused, citing the expense of firewood and the impracticality of starting a sufficient conflagration in a swamp, sir. The grave was a good 6 feet deep, but the bottom was filled with water due to the marshy ground. Thinking quickly, James removed his coat and placed the dead girl on it. Then he had his soldiers gather several large rocks. They placed the stones on the coat beneath the girl's body, and he tied her into the coat with its sleeves. James cut off the buttons from the coat, giving each of the men one and placing 2 over the girl's eyes, tied in place with his linen neck scarf. From his pocket, he took out a wooden rosary and placed it between the dead girl's fingers. Thus arranged, the 5 men solemnly lowered the corpse into the grave. Sparrow's body sank until only her blindfolded head was visible above the water as they filled in her grave. When they were finished, the 5 men uncovered their heads, and the lieutenant solemnly recited the Lord's Prayer. Once completed, he added these words of warning as the wind picked up and the sky darkened with an approaching storm. "We pray that no man disturbs this grave without consequence, and that this child rests in the eternal peace of God's love. May the angels of the Lord watch over this place. Amen. A large flock of birds took flight as the men walked away from the grave, forming a great spiral in the sky before disappearing across the plain. 2 weeks later, as the regiment prepared to join General Prideaux for the assault on Fort Niagara in Albany, the colonel noticed Lieutenant Wilson wearing a bright new linen coat. "A vast improvement over that Scottish woolen rag he's been wearing," he remarked to his aide-de-camp. It was late May 1759, May 2019. "You can't build here," said Civil Engineer James Wilson, trying to keep his voice steady. "Says who?" "I have a permit from the city," replied Harris Pierce, looking at Wilson, his construction engineer, and thinking he wouldn't have hired him if not for his attractive and accommodating wife. "Use your head, man. The last hurricane flooded this entire area and destroyed 2 blocks of buildings 200 yards west of us. The next storm could do even more damage. This land was a coastal marsh filled in with the city's garbage nearly 100 years ago. Waste makes for poor fill. The ground has compressed and sunk beneath our feet. We're standing a good 2 feet below sea level now, and that level is rising. The only thing between this building site and the Atlantic Ocean is a ridge of sand. Each hurricane strips more of that sand away. Building here is certain to cause property damage and take lives, hundreds or even thousands." Harris was a tall, attractive man, with a glib tongue and a way with the ladies. But he had no compassion for his fellow man, or concern for other people's problems. "How does that concern us? We have our permits." Wilson's frustration with the developer had been growing since he took the job, but before he could lash out in anger, a cry came from nearby. The backhoe had unearthed something. They were standing on a relatively level plain, slightly sunken in the middle. When the city began to fill the site, it bulldozed the land flat. The national seashore began to the southwest on more solid ground. That, along with the ocean view, was what made the building site as desirable as it was unsuitable. They were digging for foundations, trying to reach solid ground beneath the fill. During the excavation, bones were uncovered. Immediately, all work came to a halt. The curious onlookers gathered, staring while the supervisors anxiously peered into the ditch. "It could be a crime scene," Tom Munson suggested hopefully to Harris Pierce. Munson was the construction supervisor, and with Pierce, the developer, Jake Clinton, the excavator, and the engineer Wilson, they were partners in the project. Wilson was a tall, handsome man, still able to attract attention at 50. "From your lips to God's ears," exclaimed Jake Clinton, the one who discovered the bones. Jake usually worked alone, only hiring help when necessary. He had converted an old garage in Flatlands into a storage space for his excavation equipment. Known for his efficiency, especially among women, he was proud of his African heritage, but preferred his women to be natural blondes. Mrs. Wilson fit that description perfectly. The idea that the bones could be from a homicide was almost preferable. An archaeological site could delay construction for years across a large area, while the police would only focus on the burial site and be done in a few weeks. "Jump in, Tim, and tell us what you see," Harris said. Tim Watson was Munson's assistant, more of a gopher than a second-in-command. He was an awkward young man in his mid-20s who often went unnoticed except when there was an unpleasant task to be done. He was notorious for tripping over his own feet around attractive women. Mrs. Wilson was more than just attractive. "She's so beautiful," Tim was known to gush. Tim entered the hole cautiously and reluctantly. Just as he stepped into the trench, a dark cloud seemed to block the sun. Looking up, Wilson saw that it wasn't a cloud, but a massive flock of birds, hundreds of them twisting and turning in a great spiraling mass. Maybe 1,000 birds moved as if with a single consciousness. They rose and fell on a wind that only they could feel, as if guided by some spectral spirit. "Don't touch anything," Bob Munson ordered Tim. "Just look." "Can't see anything, it's too dark," Tim said, bending over for a closer look. "There seems to be some cloth with the bones." "Could be recent," Harris Pierce said. "Call 911 and report it. In the meantime, move the equipment over to the other side. We'll dig there for now," he directed Jake Clinton. The police were slow to respond to the call, and it took several hours for a squad car to arrive. Two bored-looking officers set up a crime scene perimeter with yellow tape. By that time, the sun was beginning to set behind the cityscape to the west. James Wilson came home as the spring afternoon turned into night. He was late as usual, and was not surprised to find the house dark and empty. His Mill Basin home occupied the entire narrow lot to accommodate the two-story, four-bedroom house. The brick facade concealed the wooden frame of the late 20th century tract house. It had a vaguely English style that his realtor wife called a Tudor colonial. He had to take her word for it. Kathy was a highly successful realtor with her own Century 21 franchise. Kathy was out again, and Jimmy couldn't remember her current excuse for being absent, or more accurately, couldn't be bothered to recall the current lie. Kathy was a tall, blue-eyed blonde who never failed to turn heads when she entered a room. As wives go, Kathy was in the 99th percentile for love, affection, and beauty. She was good-tempered and considerate. In bed, she was a tigress who always ensured her spouse was satisfied and made his desires her own. In short, she was everything a husband could ask for if he didn't mind a little flirting with other men, and was oblivious enough not to notice that her flirting went far beyond harmless, and crossed the line into infidelity. She was always remorseful, filled with guilt and sorry, yet never able to keep her promise of staying faithful beyond the next temptation. Kathy struggled with a problem that seemed to involve a significant portion of the male population. Jimmy had forgiven her countless times, no longer actively seeking out her betrayals, only learning of them when they crossed into his personal space. There were spurned lovers who blamed him for the affair's end, and arrogant men who boasted about their conquests of his wife in his presence. All these unfortunate individuals regretted their encounters with the large, powerfully built engineer skilled in jiu-jitsu. The worst part of these awkward situations was Kathy's tearful apologies on her way to forgiveness and her next infidelity. He had barely turned the lights on when the phone rang. It was Harris Pierce, and through the swearing, Jimmy understood that the police technicians had arrived at the site and immediately called in their archaeologist. The bones were ancient, very ancient. The day was bright and breezy, with a gentle wind coming off the water. It was one of those late May days that made you wish summer, with its oppressive heat and humidity, would never come. At 7 a.m., Jim exited the Belt Parkway and drove southeast through the wetlands toward the construction site. The only crew member present at that early hour was Jake Clinton, who was grumpily packing up his gear. "Morning, Jake," Jim greeted him. "Not much of a morning," Jake grumbled. "They were here when I arrived," he said, nodding toward a group at the excavation site. 5 metrosexuals and a tough-as-nails Native American woman in charge," Jake added, correcting himself after Jim's disapproving look. "Sorry, I meant 5 metrosexuals and the Native American woman in charge." Jake's hostility seemed excessive for the situation, but it quickly became clear why. Laura Brandt was a strikingly attractive woman with raven hair and a coppery complexion. Her large, dark eyes were filled with a fiery intensity that suggested she was not interested in any flirtation. "Before you ask, I can't tell you how long this will take," Laura said with frosty disdain, as she noticed Jim. It was no surprise that Jake, who usually couldn't resist flirting with attractive women, was clearly irked. "Take all the time you need," Jim said. "Take as long as you want." As he turned to leave, Laura couldn't resist responding. "Maybe we just will." Jim flashed her a smile as he walked away. The surveyors arrived as planned. They had been hired weeks earlier to take the necessary measurements for the subdivision map. Jim organized their work. Whether or not the project moved forward, though he was reasonably confident it eventually would, the map would still be useful. Other workers came by, mainly to clean and secure the site for a shutdown while the historic preservation took place. With neither Pierce nor Munson present, Jim was the senior person on site. When Tim Watson showed up, he looked disheartened. "Cheer up," Jim encouraged him. "There are better places to build. We just need to find them." As Tim walked away, he seemed to mutter something about a woman, and Jim thought, he must have struck out again. With the senior partners absent, Jim was in charge of the site. He was fully absorbed in his work, and had almost forgotten about the historical diggers on the other side of the plain. He was leaning over a steel barrel with a piece of plywood on top, using it as a makeshift desk, when he heard a voice behind him. "I came to apologize. I was quite rude earlier. I thought you were mocking me. When I asked the other workers, they told me you're opposed to building here. May I ask why?" she asked. "It's quite simple. We're below sea level, with only a narrow sand ridge separating us from the ocean." "How old are you?" he inquired. She paused, unsure of the reason for the question, and then replied, 28. "Before you turn 50, this land will be submerged. From now on, every major storm has the potential to flood this coast, destroying the buildings and drowning their inhabitants. Only the uninformed would choose to live here, and only the foolishly greedy would build here." "I understand," she replied, extending her hand. "By the way, I'm Laura Brandt, Deputy Director of the Eastern Native Archaeological Preservation Project, or ENAP, as most people call it." He started to introduce himself, shaking her small hand with his large one, but she continued for him. "You're James Wilson, a civil engineer known as Big Jim because of your impressive height of 6'8". Not impressive, just unusual. Would you like some coffee?" "We keep a pot in the project trailer." "Yes, I'd appreciate that. It was quite chilly when I arrived this morning, and although it warmed up a bit, it's still not very warm," she said as they headed toward the project trailer at the northwest corner of the site. The trailer was only about 100 yards away. The site itself spanned roughly a mile in width and half a mile in depth. The bones had been found slightly west and south of the site's center. There was something about her that made him smile both outwardly and within. It made him want to pick her up playfully like a child and lift her into the air. He longed to hear her laughter and share in it. As they strolled along, their conversation flowed. "Are there many women in archaeology?" he inquired. "More than you might expect. But just so you know, my team is all male because I'm a sexist," she replied. He had paused with his hand on the trailer's doorknob when she said this and turned in time to catch her laughter. It was a pleasant laugh, deep, genuine, and unaffected. "Sorry, I couldn't help it, but there's some truth to that. The guys handle the mud well, but the girls not so much. I knew this would be a messy job, so I brought the guys." "That's true. How do you plan to deal with the water?" he asked as they entered the site office. "We'll use pumps and filters to catch anything that comes out with the water. The mud is a different challenge. We might try freezing it and cutting it into blocks." "I'd like to see that," he said. "Feel free to come by and watch." He gestured for her to sit at a small table and poured coffee for both of them. "Any idea what you've got here?" he asked as he filled their cups. She preferred her coffee black with plenty of sugar. Holding the cup, she enjoyed the warmth it provided her hands as she spoke. "I don't like to make guesses, but it seems like there's less here than we initially thought." He didn't push her further and allowed her to continue. "The bones are definitely female and part Aboriginal, which is why we were called in. However, the site is puzzling. Initially, we see a mix of native and European artifacts. I'd estimate she dates back to the 18th century, but understanding why she's buried here in this manner, if we ever do, will be challenging." "So, it might take a long time." "Not necessarily. We'll dig a few test trenches to confirm this is an isolated grave and check for any nearby structures, but it appears she was buried alone. But if you're so opposed to building here, why continue with the project?" "Jobs are scarce, and I got involved before I realized the full scope of the plan." "Is the money really worth it?" she asked. "Yes and no. My wife is very successful, so I don't need this job for financial reasons, and sometimes I think she'd be fine if I didn't work at all. On the other hand, she invested money into this project, and I'd hate to see it wasted." "I heard your wife is attractive, but I assume she's also wealthy." "She'd describe herself as well off. As a realtor, she earns 4 times what a civil engineer makes, he said, glancing at Laura. He was aware that there were other things said about his wife, but he wasn't inclined to delve into the rumors about Kathy's reputation. Laura seemed to sense his thoughts and redirected the conversation to her excavation. The site is quite fascinating. The individual was small, like me, and of mixed race, which we can determine from the bones. We've recovered nearly the entire skeleton, so forensic pathologists might be able to determine the cause of death. She was dressed in a native deerskin garment, and there are signs of a feather and shell shawl, which could indicate a shaman if the individual were male or possibly a healer if female. What complicates things is that she was also wrapped in an unusual woolen garment. The wool is very dense and too coarse for modern fibers, but the buttons found with the skull and the remnants of linen wrapped around it, along with the prayer beads, all suggest some European influence, she concluded thoughtfully. Looks like you've got a lot on your plate. Yeah, I'll be buried in mud all day and swamped with research all night. Research? I need to see if I can find any trace of her in historical records. It's a long shot, but sometimes it pays off. After finishing their coffee, they stepped out of the trailer as the sky grew darker. More birds, he noted. Sparrows, she replied. But there are so many now. Seems like their numbers have doubled since the other day. They were around when we started digging this morning. It almost feels like they're watching us. It's a bit unsettling, but I guess it's what I should expect from European invaders, she said with a smirk. What do you mean? The sparrows, they're the European kind. You hardly ever see the native ones around here anymore, she explained. They were introduced to Central Park in the 19th century and have since taken over. Katie was at home that evening, radiating energy. It was clear to him that this was a sign that a new man had appeared in her life, most likely a married man who spent a weeknight at home with his wife. Oh dear, I'm so glad to see you. I miss my big boyfriend, but you already know that. Well, I'm not working tonight. I ordered dinner at Manzano's. Everything you love, Katie announced. She was an attractive woman, and no man could deny her charm. Unfortunately, many men have already tried their luck with Katie. If women had the ability to charm men, then Katie was a real magician. He let her lead him into the bedroom. I've scheduled the delivery for 8, so we have an hour and a half to have fun, she said. Lying next to her, exhausted, Jim could only wonder who else she was with that day and why she enjoyed talking to other men so much. It's only 7:40, darling, Katie said, sitting up to snuggle up to him. It's time for a little snack, she added. When the food arrived, Katie put on a robe and opened the door. Jim, exhausted in bed, didn't need to see to know that his wife had most likely called the bellboy. Her insatiable mood was obvious. Yes, he thought, it must be a new man, or maybe even 2. The realization was excruciating, a pain that seemed to increase with each passing day of their marriage. But what could he do? Katie was who she was, and that was just a fact. The call came early in the morning while Wilson was preparing to go to his new work site. He hadn't visited the Canarsie site for nearly a week. His last visit had been more of a social call to Laura Brandt, rather than for observing her excavation. Although she had a significant area under investigation, the project was nearing its end. He was now required at the Canarsie site immediately. Upon arrival, Wilson found the yellow tape back in place, accompanied by members of the New York City police. What happened? He asked the officer who seemed to be in charge. Who are you? I'm James Wilson, an engineer. Technically, I'm responsible for the site while we're on suspension for the archaeology dig. The detectives will want to talk to you. Eventually, 2 plainclothes detectives led him to the office trailer. They introduced themselves as Lenny Crawford and Sarah Jenner. Crawford appeared to be the lead investigator and conducted most of the questioning. When was the last time you saw Jake Clinton? Crawford demanded. I'm not sure. Maybe a week ago. Why? We're the ones asking the questions, Jenner interjected, both she and Crawford appearing hostile. Do you have any idea why he might have been here last night? Crawford continued. Not that I can think of. He was in charge of the excavation work, but that was on hold. He removed all his equipment weeks ago. He was your partner, correct? Crawford asked, as if trying to catch Wilson in a lie. Only in a loose sense. We both had a stake in this building site. Doesn't his death increase your share? Crawford probed. I don't know. Wait a minute. Are you saying he's dead? Crawford said. He's face down in the ditch they were digging, his head crushed in. After a pause, he asked, Where were you last night? At home, I replied. Can anyone confirm that? No, I was alone. Aren't you married? My wife was away on business. Does she travel often? She's a realtor, so she's very busy. I understand she was quite close to Mr. Clinton, perhaps even intimately. She knows a lot of people. They asked many more questions, and it was clear they were suspicious of Wilson. But it was Jenner's casual final question as she was leaving that unsettled Wilson, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Do you have any idea why Clinton might have been holding feathers in his hand? What? Feathers, like from a bird. Just after they left, Laura knocked on the trailer door. Once inside, she dove right into the conversation. Did they interrogate you too? They made it seem like I was the one who killed him. Yes, they gave me the 3rd degree, suggesting I did it for money or because he was seeing my wife. Was he seeing her? She asked, frowning. I don't know, I try to avoid it. I see, she said, though her tone suggested she didn't understand at all. It's not what you think. She's a complicated woman. I'm sure she is, Laura said, clearly implying the opposite. He realized there was no way to explain the situation to Laura or to change her disapproval. With a shrug, he decided to move on. What's the status of the dig? Her expression brightened. We've had a stroke of luck, something like a 1 in a million chance. The details of her death and burial are mentioned in the Freeman's Journal. What's the Freeman's Journal? Abraham Freeman was born in Africa and was brought to New York by Dutch traders as a child, where he was sold as a slave to a printer. While working in the printer's shop, he learned to read and write. After the printer's death, his widow, a Quaker, freed him. For a while, he struggled to make a living. One of his jobs was as a gravedigger. The interesting part is that after he was freed, he kept a journal of his experiences. In it, he describes the hanging of an accused witch on a hill southeast of Flatlands Village, including the execution and the subsequent burial. And you think this is the grave we've found? Wilson inquired. He mentions that the burial involved a wool coat, with silver buttons from the coat placed over the girl's eyes. The specifics match too closely to be just a coincidence. Well, it seems like you've found your answers. Yes, but this site is significant due to the date, 1759. Witch executions were outlawed in 1735 by an act of Parliament. This shows that the practice of condemning witches continued in the colonies even after it had ended in Europe. You've made an important discovery. I'm pleased for you. As Wilson turned to leave, she suddenly leaped into his arms and kissed him. Surprised, Wilson returned the kiss, but as they pulled apart, he took hold of her arms. What are you doing? I'm a married man. A flash of anger crossed her face as she snapped, Really? You should take a good look at yourself. Everyone knows what your wife is and what she does. Pretending otherwise is just foolish. Laura wriggled free from his grasp and stormed out of the trailer. He didn't pursue her at that moment. Something the detectives had mentioned was troubling him. What impact did Jake's death have on the partnership? He knew who could answer that. He called Kathy. She picked up on the 6th ring just before voicemail would have taken over. Out of breath, she rasped, What's up, my husband? Was it something in her voice or just her heavy breathing that made him think he had interrupted her with another man? Jake Clinton is dead, he told her. I know. I'm so sorry, but don't let it get to you, she replied. The police think I might have had a motive for killing him. Really? She said, feigning surprise. Wilson continued. Yes, among other reasons. They mentioned the partnership. Oh, that. Well, I suppose. Yes, the surviving partners would inherit his share. There's insurance to pay out his beneficiaries. But he only had 10%, so it's hardly a motive to kill someone. Someone had been with her and had informed her about Clinton's murder. She fully recognized that the most likely motive behind Jake Clinton's death was an angry spouse or partner, specifically Kathy Wilson's husband. He questioned whether replacing Clinton with whoever was currently in Katie's bed might distract the detectives from their suspicions. He decided to drop a shocking piece of information and see the reaction. The partnership isn't the motive, because those archaeologists have uncovered something significant that will delay this project for years. The response on the other end was silent. After a pause, he said, "I'll call you back later." About half an hour later, Harris Pierce burst into the trailer. "What on earth is going on here?" he demanded. "Aside from the murder, nothing. Remember, we're shut down," Wilson responded calmly. "Yes, but how long is all this going to take?" "No concern for Jake, I see." "What? You expect me to mourn the ditch digger?" Pierce retorted. "You handle the crying. I have condos to build." Money was the driving force behind Pierce's ambitions. He initially planned a 100-unit condo development project. Based on experience, Jim Wilson knew that Harris anticipated a profit of around $200,000 per unit, totaling approximately $20 million. Harris was the major stakeholder, owning over 50%, while Munson, the other senior partner, held about 23%. Jake had 10% before his death, with the remaining 16% divided between Kathy and Jim Wilson. Theoretically, Jim, along with his wife, stood to make over $3 million. Yet Jim viewed this potential profit as tainted and was convinced that when issues arose, and he was certain they would, Wilson, as the engineer, would be held responsible. Jim believed that Harris Pierce would feign ignorance of any potential hazards and was already gathering fabricated evidence to exonerate himself. Moreover, Jim was increasingly convinced that Harris was involved with his wife. Although Jim was not typically vengeful, he was now resolute in ensuring that Harris faced the consequences. "You should check with the parties causing the delays, the police first, then the archaeologist." Harris was reluctant to have any further dealings with the police. He saw Jim's motives as aligning with his own. Jim, unfazed, hurried to where Laura was overseeing the packaging of the artifacts discovered so far. Laura and her team had set up a large tent with several smaller enclosures inside. The police had halted the pumps, and the ditch was already filling with groundwater. Laura pondered how the site must have been when the burial occurred. The water infiltrating the grave explained why the body was wrapped in an officer's coat and weighed down. The unusual properties of the coat made of very coarse wool, and the muddy terrain helped to keep it in this form, although at one time it must have looked quite shabby. Abraham Freeman noted in his diary that the soldiers, including the officer, spoke a peculiar form of English and sometimes switched to another language which, according to the Irishman, was a kind of old language, Gaelic. Every time she looked at it, she found a new clue to the past, but each discovery only raised new questions. At first, she thought the buttons depicted a crude cross, but now she realized that they actually depicted the cross of St. Andrew I, called. His coat and buttons were of Scottish origin. The expert she consulted spoke in detail about how Scottish recruits joined the British Army from a country devastated by a failed uprising, led by a historical figure known as Prince Charming Charlie. What does it all mean? She wondered when Pierce burst into the room and asked when she would finish. She turned to him, a small figure full of rage. "Don't you understand that she was murdered?" "No," Laura exclaimed, pointing to the sturdy metal boxes that now contained the remains. Faced with her fury, Pierce took a step back and bumped right into Jim Wilson, who was following him from the trailer. Turning around, he saw the anger and hatred in Wilson's eyes. "What's your problem?" Pierce complained. The man was much taller and seemed ready to pounce on him. "Are you sleeping with my wife and asking me what's wrong?" At that moment, the birds launched their attack. The sparrows, now numerous and increasingly aggressive, descended upon the trio outside the tent in such force that the humans had to retreat inside. "What the hell is happening?" Pierce exclaimed, his voice barely contained. It felt like a scene from a Hitchcock film, though the birds soon ceased their assault. They spiraled upwards and seemed to vanish, much like a rain cloud dispersing to let the sun shine through. Pierce made a swift exit, but Munson and his assistant Tim witnessed the near confrontation. What could Kathy Wilson see in him? Tim wondered aloud, though Munson couldn't determine which man he was referring to. Like everyone else, the awkward assistant had a soft spot for the attractive Kathy. Later that day, TV news trucks arrived just in time for the evening broadcasts. Initially drawn by the murder, they stayed to cover the Indian burial ground and its witch inhabitant. The story dominated the local news reports. The crowd had swelled to over 200 people. They were reportedly peaceful but highly vocal in their protests, and their demeanor was definitely hostile. They had blocked the roadway and pushed the police barriers back, forcing the police to retreat to the construction fencing. Jim had managed to slip in from the ocean side and immediately began searching for Laura. He found her at the tent, where he assumed she had spent the night safeguarding her valuable artifacts. "What could they possibly want?" he asked when he located Laura. "The usual complaints. We're desecrating graves, disrespecting Native American culture, and perpetuating white oppression of indigenous peoples." "Oh, so you've encountered this before?" "Not in such an urban environment. Usually these excavations are in rural areas, making it harder to amass such a large crowd," she said, then sighed. "The only option is to try and wait them out. I can't risk moving the artifacts through the mob." A police lieutenant entered the tent, removed his hat, and said to Laura, "We're managing to keep the crowd at bay, but it's a struggle. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk to the leaders." Laura sighed again and, with a sense of resignation, followed the lieutenant outside. Jim followed behind, increasingly worried about the situation. The trench was nearly filled with murky black water. As an engineer, Wilson recognized this as a bad sign. The high water table and the unstable mix of sand and urban waste beneath their feet were cause for concern. 4 protesters had entered the dig site: a tall, lean man in a leather vest and fringed buckskin pants, a tall black woman in an African print dress, a short, curvy redhead, likely about 17, and a young Hispanic man in blue jeans and a plain white t-shirt. "Hello, Chief Red Cloud," Laura greeted the tall, lean man, who was clearly the leader or principal instigator, depending on your perspective. "It's Simon Red Cloud. As you know, chief is a derogatory term. But it's good to see you, Laura, even if it's just to prevent you from desecrating the graves of your ancestors." "Still peddling the same misguided nonsense to the uninformed, I see," Laura responded with a sigh, then turned to address the rest of the group. "This is not a sacred burial ground. There's only one grave here, but it has an important story to tell if you'll take the time to look and listen. This grave belongs to a healer who was executed by the ignorant people of this land, murdered, in a sense, for her good deeds. Yet she was buried by 5 men, none of whom came here voluntarily. 2 of them were brought here as slaves." "One was African," Laura said, turning to the black woman. "The other was Irish," she continued, turning to the petite redhead. "The other 3 were Scots, conscripted into the army that oppressed them, and taken to this foreign land that must have felt like the edge of the world to them." She paused to ensure she had their attention. "They laid her gently in this damp ground, wrapped in a wool army coat. They placed the coat's silver buttons over her eyes." She held up a button for everyone to see. "It bears the saltire, the flag of Scotland, perhaps a defiant touch on an English army coat. They buried her here and said a simple prayer over her," she said, looking at the ditch she had dug, now filled with water. Spreading her arms wide, she added, "This is the story I've come to uncover and share." At that moment, thousands of birds took flight, swooping and swirling. The red-headed girl screamed as a body surfaced from the depths of the ditch water. "I have no idea who would want to kill Harris Pierce," James Wilson insisted. He was sitting in a drab green room at the police station, at a table that looked like it had come from a thrift store. Are you really telling us you don't have a motive to kill the man who was involved with your wife, and whose death would have given you a hefty share of $20 million? Detective Sergeant Sarah Jenner asked, having dismissed any pretense that Detective Crawford was in charge. You're mistaken on both counts. First, the site isn't profitable, so there's no $20 million windfall. And as for my wife, she knows a lot of men. Remember, you previously claimed she was the motive behind Jake Clinton's murder. Yes, and Harris Pierce's alibi for that murder was your wife, who told us she spent the entire night with Pierce. Doesn't that suggest something? Only a lunatic would try to eliminate all of my wife's lovers. Playing the clueless cuckold is convenient, but you have a substantial criminal record, Jenner said, placing a printout on the table. I've never been convicted of any crime. But you've been charged with assault 7 times. You've sent 2 men to the hospital. It seems you have a tendency to get quite angry with those who are involved with your wife. All those charges were dropped. Yes, your wife handled it for you. She convinced her lovers to back off. Do you have any idea how she managed that? Did you examine the body, Detective Jenner? Jim asked, clearly frustrated. Are you going with the boogeyman theory, like your girlfriend? The corpse was torn to pieces with claw marks from an animal. Very convenient. You'll need to explain how you accomplished that. Was it Laura's plan to blame it on some ancient spirit? Why would she want Pierce dead? To halt the building project, that was the source of their argument. There was no argument. Pierce was upset because he wanted the excavation completed, but the construction project was already doomed. The ground won't support it. Mr. Munson has a different story. He's pushing ahead with the project, Jenner countered. Then why aren't you questioning him? He stands to gain a lot more than I do. Mr. Munson and especially his assistant have been very cooperative. They claim you are only involved in this project because of your wife, and that you harbored resentment toward both her and Mr. Pierce. So why kill Jake? To fabricate a story about an Indian ghost. Clinton uncovered the bones, and as Ms. Brandt knows, Pierce is a descendant of one of the men who originally placed those bones there, just like you. What? Your new girlfriend didn't mention that while she was persuading you to eliminate Clinton and Pierce. The questioning lasted all day and well into the night, but eventually they had to release Jim. Kathy provided him with an alibi, and there was no evidence suggesting that Laura could have committed the crime on her own. After his release, Wilson headed straight to the Canarsie site, where he found Laura in the main tent by the artifacts. She was setting up a sleeping bag, clearly planning to stay the night. "Got room for 2?" he asked. "What are you doing here?" "It's not safe," she replied. "Do you think the ghost is going to get me?" he said with a chuckle. "This isn't a joke. There's something really strange going on. It's a bizarre coincidence that one of the deceased is related to a key figure in the execution, and the other was the first to disturb the grave. Laura, you're a scientist. How can you believe in ghosts? There are too many odd occurrences and coincidences. Like you, James Wilson, a descendant of the man who wrapped her in his coat, and Pierce, who was involved in her death. The Pierce family, I admit, has been here since before the American Revolution, but you're mistaken about me. My great-great-grandfather arrived with his sister from Ireland during the potato famine. Their mother died on the voyage, and their father had passed away in Ireland before they set sail. The orphaned siblings were placed in a Catholic orphanage run by nuns. The girl adapted well, but the boy ran away. He eventually made his way to Canarsie and was taken in by a pig farmer named Wilson, adopting his surname. So, you see, I have no connection to this grave. He finished speaking and moved closer to her, looming over her as he did. The spirit may not be fully aware of your origin, she said, looking into his deep blue eyes. But she needs to know who broke the peace in her house. You're the one in danger. I have to stay here to guard the artifacts until we can move them. Red Cloud's people can take them away. I'll stay with them until I'm sure they're safe. And I'm going to stay with you until I'm sure you're safe. Why, James? What do I mean to you? Don't play games with me. I felt it from the very first day we met. I have to deal with a lot of deception at home. I don't need that from you. Then, make it clear. What did you feel and what do you feel now? This, he said, pulling her to him and silencing her protest with a kiss. He lifted her up easily, as if she were no heavier than a feather. He was not only tall, but also incredibly strong. There were no more words between them. There was no hurry. They got into bed slowly. You don't have to do this, she said. But I want to, he replied. When it was over, they lay entwined in each other. Their souls merged into one. The gentle sounds of the morning woke them up before the sunlight penetrated the tent. She woke up in his arms and woke him up with a kiss. Good morning, he said with a smile. She kissed him back. We can't stay here forever. I know what I'm going to tell my wife? What is it? He asked, enlivening their conversation. She pulled away, confusion on her face. Say goodbye to her, she suggested. I can't. Not like this. I don't want to hurt her. To hurt her? This unrepentant girl of easy virtue? The main question is why you stayed with her. You don't understand. She can't control herself. It's an addiction. Okay, she's addicted. You don't give the possibility of addiction. By staying with her, you're only preventing her from facing the consequences of her actions. You may be right, but choose, she demanded, getting up. It's either her or me. He never had a chance to make a decision, as the tent flap suddenly opened and Detective Jenner entered with a squad of police. James Wilson and Sarah Brandt, I am arresting you for the murders of Jake Clinton, Harris Pierce, and Thomas Manson. Manson? They both asked in unison. Jenner grinned. You'd be more convincing if Manson's body hadn't been found 2/10 of a mile away. The bail hearing was quick and straightforward. The prosecutor wanted them imprisoned in the depths of the Brooklyn Detention Center. But the defense attorneys convinced the judge, since there was no direct evidence yet, and bail was granted. Kathy paid for Jim's bond and for Laura's as well, through her employer. Outside the courthouse, Kathy hugged Jim, kissed him, and told him she forgave him. It's not your fault. She's cast a spell on you. We didn't kill anyone. I didn't kill anyone. She didn't kill anyone, Wilson insisted. Seeing Laura emerge from the courthouse, he called out to her. Laura didn't respond or acknowledge him. She was with a group of well-dressed people whom he assumed were from her organization. Laura got into a town car parked by the curb, and the group drove away. You need to stay away from Ms. Brandt, the lawyer advised. Why? We didn't do anything. The lawyer let out a frustrated sigh and replied, It doesn't matter what you did. It's about what the prosecutor claims you did. This system is biased. The prosecution usually wins, regardless of guilt or innocence. Right now, you and Ms. Brandt are the only suspects. One of you will be convicted. Let's try to make sure it's not you. Jim had been driving for hours, and the argument with Kathy had been anything but pleasant. She couldn't grasp why he was leaving her. It's that Indian bitch, she charged. Only partly. I just can't handle it anymore. Each of your betrayals cuts deeper than the last. Clinton, Pierce, Munson, and so many more. It never ends. But I'll change. I swear there won't be anyone else. It'll just be us. No, you've made that promise too many times. I no longer believe you can change. Please, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face as she clung to him while he left the house. She crumpled in the doorway as he drove away. He drove around aimlessly for hours, stopping for dinner and gas before continuing on. Despite being advised not to, he couldn't resist heading towards Canarsie and the excavation site. That was where he hoped to find her, the true love of his life. The only uncertainty was whether she felt the same way. By the time it was past 2 a.m., Jim spotted the campfire south of the parkway, at the far end of the archaeological dig. He took the next exit and drove along the service road, keeping a safe distance from the excavation. As he approached, he saw the Subaru SUV partially obscured by the tall weeds in the firelight. He parked his truck about 10 feet from the Subaru and walked over to where he could see a figure illuminated by the firelight. Laura sat staring at the flames as if hypnotized, but turned to face him as he approached. "I see you're not afraid of ghosts," she remarked. "You don't believe in them," he replied, "as in the 3 dead men." He could only mumble as he dragged the box over to sit on it. Laura was sitting cross-legged on the bare ground, dressed in deerskin, with her hair braided. She began to hum softly as if falling into a trance. "Just so I know, should we expect a ghost to appear?" he asked. "You need to be quiet. You've read Abraham Freeman's story. Your ancestor cursed anyone who disturbed the sparrow's grave. We need to appease the souls of the dead." "But what about the living?" he asked. "I think they should solve their own problems." I feel a hint of reproach. "Why should I criticize you for being attached to your unreliable wife?" she asked with obvious sarcasm. "Yes, I understand that you disapprove, but of course you have a little compassion." "What now? Do you want my pity?" "Not for myself, but for Katie. She can't do anything about who she is, and it hurts her more than anyone else." "You're a fool, James Wilson," Laura said, jumping to her feet and pointing at him. "This woman does not love you, has never loved you, and will not love you." "I see," he said, "but you really love me." With that, he pulled her onto his lap and kissed her. She tried to resist, but, in the end, they both fell on the sand. They wrestled for a while before passion took over, and they dissolved into each other's arms. When they finally broke down, she said, "What am I supposed to do? I love you. What should I do?" "First, you need to get your facts straight. I'm not related to that Wilson, remember." "Actually, you are. Your great-great-grandfather married the farmer's daughter, who was the great-granddaughter of a Scottish army officer wounded at Fort Niagara. He was discharged when his regiment went back to New York. I looked it up." "I see. So I should be wary of the ghost," he said with a chuckle. "I'll handle it," she replied. "How do you plan to do that?" "I brought some dry wood and a sterno can. I've been keeping the fire burning all night to make it hot enough to burn the bones," she explained. "You're going to destroy them." "It's the tradition of her people. They place the body above ground for a year on a hide stretched between poles. When spring comes after that year, they take down the body, clean the bones, and burn them to ashes, which they then scatter. I will burn her bones and spread her ashes to release her from this world." "You're serious," he said. To prove it, she added more wood to the fire, watching it flare up. "All right, where are the bones?" he asked. "You're sitting on them." He stood up and opened the crate. Inside, wrapped in what looked like birch bark, were 3 bundles of bones. Laura took one bundle from the crate, placed it on the fire, and as she did, she recited words in a language he didn't understand. "What did you say?" "It's a prayer asking the Mother in heaven to guide her spirit to the next world." By the time the last bundle was consumed by the flames, dawn was approaching. Jim wrapped his arms around Laura from behind and held her tightly as they watched the fire slowly die down to embers. He kissed the back of her neck and leaned in for another kiss, but he was interrupted before he could proceed. "What was that?" he asked, half expecting a ghost to emerge from the clump of weeds to his right. Instead, Tim Watson appeared, holding a gun in one hand and a crowbar in the other. "I hate to interrupt this moment," Watson said with clear sarcasm, "but if you two would kindly move towards that charming ditch you've dug." "What's happening, Tim?" Wilson asked. "You're an engineer, Jim. Surely you can figure this out," Tim taunted. "You're the ghost," Laura exclaimed. "But why?" "Because he wants Kathy," Jim replied. "Exactly. I knew you'd get it." He's going to kill us because of this girl of easy virtue, Laura protested. Watch your language, bitch, Watson said, brandishing the gun. Jim started laughing as he stepped back from the ditch. You see, he wants her, so he's getting rid of the competition. You don't deserve her, Watson said, advancing a step closer. How wrong detectives are. It's not about the money. And yet, why kill me? I'm just a cuckolded husband. She won't leave you. She says she loves you. But she should love me. The man who truly loves her. She'll see that once you're out of the picture. That's a peculiar way of showing love for your wife. What makes you think you'll do any better? Laura interjected. No one asked for your opinion, bitch, Tim said, his hands beginning to tremble. To Jim, Timothy Watson seemed like a man who was losing touch with reality. If he believed he could keep a woman like Kathy by eliminating his rivals, he was either completely insane or potentially the most notorious mass murderer in history, or perhaps both. We're heading to the ditch. Move, Watson ordered, aiming his gun threateningly. And what if we refuse? Jim inquired. Then I'll shoot her first. Laura stepped forward. Go ahead. But Jim pulled her back. Do what he says. All right, but I have a question, Laura said. How did you get the others to come here? Watson chuckled. It was simple. I texted them pretending to be Kathy, suggesting a meeting here to avoid her jealous husband. They couldn't get here fast enough. Any more questions? He taunted. Yes, does she make all of you stupid? Or does she just attract stupid men? They faced east, with Tim's back to the horizon where the first light of dawn was breaking. Sparrows were beginning their morning flight, initially just a few, but soon hundreds would be fluttering and diving at the western end of the trench. Jim led them in a sideways approach, waiting for his moment. As dawn broke and the flock swooped low over them, he seized his opportunity. When the birds suddenly descended upon them, Watson ducked, and Jim, waiting for this precise moment, tackled him. They wrestled over the gun and a shot rang out. The two men parted ways, and for a moment Laura couldn't discern who had been struck. But then Watson staggered and collapsed. Instantly, she found herself embracing Jim and weeping. It's all right. We're safe now. The sparrows saved us. No, she replied. Look at the ground. It was covered in feathers, and in the early morning light he could see they were of a different hue. These are American sparrow feathers, not European. She saved us. The sparrow saved us. The little bird that sits in the tree? The American tree sparrow. Jim glanced around, but the birds had vanished. He searched in every direction, but they were nowhere to be seen. Mother in heaven sent them to guide her to the next world, Laura declared solemnly. At that moment, the engineer could not argue with her. The wind had risen and scattered the ashes of the fire over the damp earth. He knew all too well that soon this land would be submerged, just as the sparrow had foretold.